It's a case of a small plane in which 4 people were traveling. A family from New York who had left from Puerto Rico were planning to arrive in southern Miami.
11 in the morning last Monday. That was the last contact, meaning now in 15 minutes it will be 48 hours in which there was no contact at all. Did you know anomalies in the area have been recorded since Christopher Columbus's time? Did you know some people claim they were lost there for years? What did they experience? And, on the other hand, what was the relationship that the place had with a famous and peculiar prophet which very few people talk about? That's what we'll discuss in this report, along with other topics. This is one of the most iconic mysteries of all time, and year after year, articles continue to be written that explore its various aspects. Documentaries are also plentiful, and from time to time, fiction draws inspiration from its coordinates to launch a bestseller or a box office hit. The area covers more than 1 million square kilometers. Much of the North Atlantic traffic passes through there, as does the infamous Gulf Stream. Is this inconvenient combination of heavy maritime traffic and unstable weather the explanation for the numerous disappearances? It would make sense, of course, but how do you explain everything else? There was talk of a mist with the ability to alter space and time, of interdimensional portals, of an ancient lost civilization, of extraterrestrial ships, of ghost pirate ships, and even of mythical monsters. Get rid of your compasses, because they won't do you any good. Today we're going to a place from which many never return. Welcome to the Bermuda Triangle Cayce. Before we begin, I'd like you to tell me, if you had already heard about the Bermuda Triangle, how did you learn about this place? Mostly through magazines. I learned a lot from magazines like Muy Interesante. Get to know more. These are magazines that existed when I was a kid, and maybe they opened my mind a bit to these kinds of cases and other topics. How did you all first hear about the Bermuda Triangle case? I invite you to share your story down below, and I also invite you to leave comments with suggestions for possible future videos. Now let's get started. Who are the ones who were born? Seekers of strange stories started 2022 glued to their computers, trying to investigate a particular piece of news. According to it, the Friday, January 1st, the United States Coast Guard had officially announced that they were ending the search for a missing vessel. The tragedy had a significant detail: the area where that vessel had gone missing. The ship, which was carrying about 20 people, had stopped transmitting signals after leaving Bimini on Monday, December 28th. Its goal was to reach Lake Worth in Florida, 128 kilometers away. However, it had never arrived at its destination. A quick map review gives us a certainty. That area is included in what is known as the Devil's Triangle or the Bermuda Triangle. Authorities in the Bahamas reported that members of the Royal Defense Force Search and Rescue Unit and the Marine Infantry Division of the police had joined the search efforts. Airplanes had also participated in the rescue operation. However, as we mentioned earlier, after 84 hours and covering 44,000 square kilometers, the search had been called off. The most devout entrusted the lives of the missing to the deity of the moment. The more analytical ones reviewed the weather records over and over again, trying to figure out if a storm could have been present. After the incident, a third group said little could be done. The triangle had claimed another victim, and that was just more evidence, so much that the mystery was still alive, more than alive. The debate started immediately. Possible explanations for the phenomenon multiplied on websites and in newspapers, from conspiracy enthusiasts to scientists and scholars. Everyone had something to contribute. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before delving into possible answers, let's find out how the questions began, before the triangle was known as such. The surrounding area, especially the coast of the Carolinas, was already known for its numerous shipwrecks, and the captains referred to it by the unfriendly name of the Atlantic Graveyard. The information about these shipwrecks was compiled in 1950 by an Associated Press journalist named Edward Van Winkle Jones. The man added to the list the names of other ships, planes, and small vessels that had also disappeared, and he called the phenomenon mysterious. Although he didn't investigate much further, the matter gained more popularity when, 2 years later, it reached the legendary magazine Fate. Fate is an American magazine about paranormal phenomena, co-founded in 1948 by Raymond A. Palmer, editor of Amazing Stories, and Cartier Fuller, promoted as the world's leading magazine on the paranormal. It has published expert opinions and personal experiences related to UFOs, psychic abilities, ghosts, cryptozoology, Fortean phenomena, and telepathy, among many other topics. It was in those pages that George Ixtal Sand published in 1952 that there was an area of the Atlantic that was extremely dangerous and strange because of its record. With a bold pen, George spoke of ships that were never heard from again, and of aircraft that would never communicate with their bases again. In a world that had just recently come out of a war and was still paying the consequences of it. An area where these things happened was enough to fuel all kinds of paranoia. However, it took a little more than a decade for the matter to be given its definitive name. It was the year 1964 when the writer Vincent Gaiddis captivated the audience of Argos magazine. With an article, it was determined that the disappearance area formed a triangle with vertices at Miami, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the Bermuda Islands. The article was titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, and it was an immediate success. Letters soon began to arrive at the publication's editorial office asking for more and more details. Apparently, recycling stories just needed an attractive name to finally become established in the collective imagination. While ships kept sinking, a name was emerging to the surface that even today is synonymous with intrigue. The writers who came after Gaiddis didn't always strictly follow the boundaries he had established. Some even extended the perimeter of the triangle all the way to the west coast of Ireland, knowing that he had a gold mine on his hands. Gaiddis published a book in 1965 titled Invisible Horizons: The True Mysteries of the Sea, in which he devoted an extensive chapter to the newly born Bermuda Triangle. There, Gaiddis tried to narrate what he considered to be the Genesis event, the event that, according to him, accounted for the first documented disappearance in that paradigmatic sector of the map. Gaiddis claimed that in that event, no more and no less than 27 people had disappeared. Watch out for turbulence and fasten your seatbelts. We're about to find out. What happened to 5 planes that disappeared? In 1945, although the war had ended, the United States Air Squadrons based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was still conducting military exercises. That's why, on December 5, 1945, at 210 Post Meridian, a patrol made up of 5 Grumman TBF Avengers set out on a mission to drop their bombs on a reef that served as a practice field. The mission was made up of 14 men who were led by Charles Taylor, an experienced 28-year-old pilot who had fought during the Pacific War. It was a routine job, and less than an hour after taking off, Taylor communicated with the operations base to announce that they had already dropped the bombs according to the established protocol. Immediately after, he stated that the 5 aircraft were beginning their return to the starting point. Everything seemed in order, except that half an hour later, Taylor took the microphone to give a puzzling message. He didn't know where they were. Somehow they had become disoriented, and the primitive navigation technology of the device wasn't helping him. Still keeping calm, Taylor announced that they would make some turns, especially because the fuel gauge was dropping drastically. At 17:24, a new communication arrived with an emergency tone and heavy static. It made it impossible for the planes to hear the base personnel, but they could still hear the desperate pilots. By 1820, the message was grim. The compasses and flight instruments had gone crazy. Without wasting any time, 3 aircraft took off from Fort Lauderdale to try to locate the 5 Avengers. The result was tragic. The Avengers planes were never found. One of the rescue planes carrying 13 crew members was also lost at sea. Or at least, that's what was believed at first by the rescuers. It had exploded just a few kilometers after taking off. These unfortunate events, which ended with the impossibility of recovering the bodies of 27 people, gave the initial push for the Bermuda Triangle to experience its modern boom. The case, as we said, was brought back by Cayce from the Annals of Aeronautical Disasters. Thus a small but significant milestone. This gave substance to the phenomenon everyone was discussing more emphatically. In 1974, the final blow would come and the Bermuda Triangle would finally be established as a cursed place. The culprit, a certain Charles Berlitz. Charles Berlitz was born in New York on November 20, 1914. He was a polyglot and the grandson of the founder of the Berlitz language schools. In his early years, he worked in the family business and took part in writing language courses. Then he graduated from Yale University with honors and spent 13 years in the United States Army, mainly in the intelligence branch. His future in that field was more than promising. If not for Charles, he'd be known for something else. His years of contacts with military personnel had brought him closer to various stories, many of them strange. Charles quickly became obsessed with these stories and devoted himself to writing popular science. His books about paranormal phenomena were well received from the beginning. But it wasn't until 1974 that Charles would finally become a cult author, by releasing a work that would sell the, by no means insignificant, amount of 20 million copies. What was the name of the book, The Bermuda Triangle? It started with the story of the flight we just learned about, but quickly listed other documented incidents of disappearances that still had no apparent explanation. Many of them even belonged to previous decades. With this work, Charles sought to document that what was happening in the triangle was bigger than what they had assumed, to be exact. By that time, the audience was ecstatic. Stories like that of the Cyclops had left everyone stunned in terms of loss of life and the size of the ship. The case of the United States ship Cyclops is probably the last great mystery when it comes to maritime disappearances. Or at least that's what many scholars on the subject claim. The Cyclops, with its 165 meters in length and 20 meters in width, was a large supply ship of the United States Navy. The press called it a floating coal mine. In 1918, the Cyclops was converted into a warship and served as a support unit for the troops deployed in France during World War I, and several heavy machine guns were installed on its deck. On January 9th, the Cyclops was assigned a mission that took it to the Brazilian coast. It was supposed to supply coal to the British ships operating in the South Atlantic. The operation was a success, and on February 15th, the ship returned to sea with its 309 men on board. It's worth clarifying that, built in Philadelphia, the Cyclops was designed to carry 10,500 tons of coal, but on its last voyage, the ship had been loaded with almost 11,000 tons of manganese ore, much denser and much heavier. It was expected to dock in Baltimore in mid-March. As you can imagine, that never happened. When there were just a few kilometers left before it reached the port, and just as it was passing through the Bermuda Triangle, the ship simply stopped transmitting signals. The Cyclops twin brothers, the Proteus and the Nereus, would disappear in a similar way in 1941 during the course of World War II. There are reports indicating that on March 10th, a violent storm broke out right in the area where the Cyclops was sailing. Some researchers suggest that its disappearance was due to a chain of misfortunes, overloading, engine problems. The commander would have reported these, but no one wanted to be responsible. And what about the bad weather? Other theories point out that the ship's captain, George Worley, was of German origin and may have been responsible for conspiring against his own crew to provide help to the side of his home country. What happened to the Cyclops? Despite many searches, it's as if it vanished without a trace. Or in this case, the water. Charles Berlitz made a detailed report about what happened to the Cyclops and other vessels. always placing special emphasis on the unusual events that often accompany the disappearances. But what was happening in the Bermuda Triangle? When looking for an answer to this, Charles let his imagination run wild. And that's how our story goes back to the beginning. Let's learn about the possible answers to the enigma. In his book, Charles offers a set of conventional explanations, generally given by the United States Coast Guard and aviation company operators or sailors familiar with the area. Among these explanations, we can find sudden storms, accidents between ships due to the absence of effective lighthouses, negligence by inexperienced and overconfident captains, and a long and predictable etc. However, Charles strongly insists when analyzing the large number of cases. According to the author, many sinkings and accidents happened even with favorable weather. How can that be explained? National Aeronautics and Space Administration specialists stated that when satellites pass through that anomaly, they are bombarded with more intense radiation than anywhere else in orbit. This irregularity is known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, and it causes what is colloquially called the Bermuda Triangle to come as close as 124 miles to the Earth's surface, causing disturbances that could affect navigation instruments, which could lead to naval and air accidents. Another theory within the rational line talks about methane bubbles that, when rising from the bottom of the sea, would end up exploding because of the waves, creating a disturbance capable of dragging along vessels of all sizes. This hypothesis is interesting because it can explain the sinking despite good weather conditions, but how good is it? As an explanatory hypothesis for cases in which airplanes disappear, with the same rigor with which the official explanations from the Navy are collected, Charles offers a look at reports that are somewhat more controversial. Reports that talk about strange lights in the sky and under the surface of the sea, reports that describe disappearances of a strange nature. Is the Bermuda Triangle an area of interest for extraterrestrials? How can we explain the nearly phosphorescent mist that many sailors report seeing there? Is the place used as an experimentation center? And what if the ships don't disappear but are teleported? Are there connections between what happens in the triangle and the supposed Philadelphia experiment? Many of these stories and explanations lead to more related videos, because the Bermuda Triangle is really a topic that branches off too much into other issues. So if you're interested in us making a second part about the Bermuda Triangle, you can leave your comment. If this video gets over 3,000 comments, we'll make a second part, maybe expanding on some of these cases that we're mentioning and touching on briefly in this video. Let's continue. On the other hand, Charles did not overlook the testimonies of divers who are convinced that in that specific place there is a huge animal. On many occasions, they glimpsed it during their ocean floor expeditions. Were the ships that were found adrift actually rammed? Not by big waves, but by a terrible creature unique in its kind? Again, this explanation doesn't seem to shed light on the large number of planes that never reappear once they enter the triangle. Another mystery is, why is it so difficult to recover the remains of the ships or aircraft? Is it because they fell victim to pilot error? Or bad weather conditions? Shouldn't their parts be somewhere? Starting from one of these premises, Charles developed one of the theories, which is considered the most bizarre. But to understand it, first we need to talk about Edgar Cayce, also known as the Sleeping Prophet. Edgar Cayce was born near Hopkinsville in the state of Kentucky on March 18, 1877, according to his biographers. As a child, he had plenty of imaginary friends who disappeared over time before adolescence. Edgar was struck very hard on the head with a baseball, so he was taken to the emergency hospital. There, after a while, he was declared dead. However, just as they were about to take him to the morgue, there was no sign of a blow or trauma on him. In December 1893, Edgar joined the Disciples of Christ as a missionary, teaching the Bible on Sundays. In meetings with other believers, he would casually say that he saw auras and heard the voices of dead people. In 1900, he suffered a mild laryngitis and lost his voice. He underwent various tests and treatments, always in vain. After a year, and almost convinced that he would never speak again, Edgar was hypnotized by a traveling hypnotist named Hart from Logman. This hypnotist couldn't help Edgar, but he introduced him to another skilled professional in those arts, Al Lane. To the surprise of the audience present, Edgar spoke during that second session, but unconsciously. He referred to himself as we and fell into a kind of trance. The one who manifested claimed not to be Edgar, but an entity. Lane calmly asked the entity about Edgar's problem. It answered that his speech disorder was caused by poor blood circulation in his throat. Lane asked if that was curable, and the entity said to wait. A few minutes later, the entity manifested to say that the work was already done. Indeed, Edgar had regained his voice in a way that many did not hesitate to consider miraculous. But of course, Edgar was not the same after that. From that moment on, he became a vehicle for the entity to continue communicating and to give its diagnosis regarding a wide variety of problems. The manifestations were known at that time as readings. Edgar did not remember anything that was said during his readings and depended on transcriptions from the witnesses. Since in his trance state he seemed to be in a deep sleep, he was nicknamed the Sleeping Prophet. Edgar received letters from people he didn't know and prescribed treatments to patients who could be thousands of miles away. But not only that, he also used his gift to help search for oil and even predicted the Wall Street stock market crash when they asked him where all the oil came from. The knowledge from the readings. Edgar explained that while he slept, he accessed a kind of storehouse where there was a record of everything that had happened since the beginning of time. In 1943, Edgar was hired by the United States government to locate soldiers missing in action. And how is this guy connected to today's story? Very simple. Edgar claimed to have had visions about the civilization of Atlantis. Charles Berlitz studied Edgar's statements in depth, and he came to the conclusion that Atlantis would be submerged precisely in the area of the Bermuda Triangle. When Edgar said in one of his sessions that the lost civilization had been more advanced than ours and had even managed to manufacture laser weapons, Charles saw how everything connected before his eyes. The writer was convinced that at the bottom of the Sargasso Sea there was an Atlantean ray cannon that had survived, and that, according to his words, it would activate from time to time randomly, destroying the marine and air traffic that passed through the area. Of course, this speculation caused Charles to gain a few detractors. The most notable of them was named Lawrence Cayce. For many, the most serious attempt to understand the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle is credited to the pilot and librarian from the University of Arizona, Lawrence David Cayce, author of The Bermuda Triangle Mystery.
Solved?
In his book, he says he knew what to expect when he started checking the accuracy of Charles's information. His thorough examination of the evidence delivered a clear verdict. The vast majority of the reports were based on events whose dates and locations were incorrect. Other events had been altered to favor the most conspiratorial, and others quite simply had never happened. The legend of the Bermuda Triangle, wrote Cayce, began because of careless investigation and was developed and perpetuated by writers who, consciously or unconsciously, relied on errors, faulty reasoning, or simple sensationalism. According to Lawrence, Charles Berlitz wrote the Bermuda Triangle at the perfect time. At the beginning of the 1970s, the Swiss Erich von Däniken had stirred things up with his saga about extraterrestrial astronauts who visited Alaska. Ancient times. Spielberg had done the same with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The public was eager for these topics, even though they had the support of many. Cayce's criticism, so determined to discredit Charles, fails to fully explain the phenomenon. That's why, over time, researchers have chosen to maintain a middle ground between both positions, with a simple purpose: to continue gathering information. And thanks to that collection of information, a historian revealed some time ago that perhaps Christopher Columbus himself had been the victim of a paranormal event. In what we now know as the Bermuda Triangle, On October 11, 1492, just a few hours before Christopher Columbus's expedition reached the shores of the Caribbean island of Guanahani, and the so-called discovery of America took place, something happened that remained in the shadows for decades. The event became known as the Skylights Incident, and although it is officially documented, many tried to downplay its importance, considering it insignificant, until historians showed up, dusted off old files, and presented them at conferences around the world. What happened on that day can be summarized as follows. In the middle of the night, the crew members of La Pinta, one of the iconic caravels, witnessed a very peculiar phenomenon. Some strange lights were seen on the horizon, lights that moved from one side to the other. It was later learned that the captain of the Santa Maria and some members of La Niña also witnessed the strange dance of lights that was happening just a few meters away. Even Columbus himself would record the sequence in his personal diary. Many argued that what Columbus and his men saw that night could have been some kind of torch that a native was carrying on a nearby shore. Other research has suggested that the sailors were not less than 80 kilometers from the possible shores, which made it practically impossible for them to see anything that was happening there. What did all this mean? It's simple. If the lights weren't coming from the earth, it was because they were flying over the sky at water level. Meteors then? Maybe shooting stars? Many people came to the conclusion that Cristobal Colon might have seen UFOs in the area we now know as the Bermuda Triangle. Can we say, in light of this testimony, that strange activity began in the area even earlier than we think? The truth is that the Bermuda Triangle hasn't just swallowed ships and planes without a trace. Sometimes those who cross it have managed to escape its grasp. In this sense, perhaps the strangest case is that of Thomas Brown, an American man who returned in 2009 after being missing for 7 years. What he told would bring several mysteries. On October 28, 2009, 56-year-old Thomas was excited to attend a ceremony honoring his career. The man had worked for 30 years building swimming pools. To ease his anxiety a bit, Thomas decided to take a ride on his boat from the coast of Florida. He left a note for Martha, his wife, saying he would be back in a few hours. However, he didn't return. The media quickly picked up the story. Where was Thomas? Had he run away? That seemed unlikely. Thomas didn't seem like someone who was unhappy with his life. An accident? Maybe? Even stranger since the weather had been clear? One way or another, after arduous days of searching, the authorities and Thomas's wife had lost all hope of finding him alive. Until on August 25, 2016, Martha, who seemed to have accepted being a widow, received a call. The police asked her to go to a medical center to discuss the matter of her husband's disappearance. When she arrived at the hospital, the nurses took Martha to a special room where there was a thin, toothless man. Although he looked terrible, there was no doubt. That was Thomas. When the man regained his strength, he explained that afternoon 7 years ago. His boat had stopped working in the middle of the trip, even though there was no apparent damage. Little by little, the current had carried him into the Bermuda Triangle, and there was nothing he could do to avoid it. A day later, Thomas had arrived at an island with strange red moss growing everywhere. On the shores, there were dozens of stranded boats and ships, airplane fuselages, and a monkey that seemed to be the only animal around. The man searched the island for signs of civilization but found nothing. As time went by, Thomas had to manage to find food and water. He learned to make fire with the red moss and built a shelter that kept him alive for a long 84 months. Months during which he also dedicated himself to building some improvised sails for his boat. After finishing them, he set out, leaving his fate to destiny. Realizing he had to find land soon or have no options, he underestimated it. A few days later, he awoke to Coast Guard sirens as they curiously surrounded his boat. The story became world famous. Was Thomas telling the truth? Could the Bermuda Triangle possibly lead to some kind of island belonging to an alternate reality? In May 1991, Roberto Cerboni, director of the scientific search project firm, announced that he had found the remains of 5 TBM Avengers, just 5 TBM Avengers off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. At first, it was thought that these were the planes lost in 1945. Later, it was discovered that they belonged to another fleet. Some media outlets ran the headline, "The Mystery Doubles." Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, is now regarded as one of the most famous psychics in the United States. The Association for Research and Enlightenment currently preserves all the readings, about 14,000 in total. He is also considered the father of holistic medicine. In September 2022, there were new disappearances in the Triangle. The ship with which this story began is still missing. Without a doubt, the mystery remains alive. As we said, there are thousands of testimonies, and there are even theories that talk about many interconnected mysterious triangles that would be in different parts of the map. But that's another topic. By 2023, a cruise ship has announced that it will cross those waters that some don't hesitate to describe as cursed. Just in case. The company organizing the trip clarified that if an unexpected event occurs, customers will be refunded 100% of their money. And the question is more than obvious. After hearing this whole report, would you dare to venture into this place known as the Bermuda Triangle? I invite you to answer that question below in the comments. Let me remind you that if we exceed the limit of 3,000 comments, we will make a second part, maybe covering some of the topics we touched on in this video. I want to thank each and every member of this channel who are the ones appearing here next to me, because thanks to them, we can make this kind of video which are often demonetized or hidden from recommendations by YouTube. I also want to remind everyone that if you want to make a contribution to this video, you have the super chat option enabled right here, where you write. You will see an option that says super chat or super thanks. It should say super thanks. Depending on how you have YouTube set up, the option will appear there. You tap there and you can make a donation to the channel, which obviously helps us a lot to keep moving forward with this project. Please leave suggestions for future videos. That's all for now. Goodbye. I'm Magnus Mephisto. See you next time. Goodbye.